So recently I saw this topic of discussion that actually popped up on a YouTuber called Ancient Gameplays. I follow him, I love his videos, I think he's got a great channel, and I saw he made a video on Unreal Engine 4 with ray tracing for stutters. And now I believe he then got this story off Digital Foundry, who then Digital Foundry saw a Reddit post and decided to test out the settings that were claiming were making massive stutters. And then they found that massive stuttering. And then Ancient Gameplays also found out there was massive stuttering in these titles. Now, what we're hearing here is, okay, there's massive stuttering on AMD RX 9000 series cards in especially two titles that I checked out here today. That's Hellblade, as well as another title called The Ascent. But what you're hearing here is really, when I started testing things out, we're only getting a very small snippet of the story. And when I started going into this whole endeavor, I put it because it's been actually a pretty big journey, started realizing there is so much more to this story than meets the eye, to the point where, let's get over some of the weirdest news, and that is one of the games, that's The Ascent, for instance, it does stutter indeed a lot on the RX 9070 that we tested here. But what we're failing to see is that it also runs like absolute crap with ray tracing turned on the B580. And then for the NVIDIA counterpart, in this particular game, if you don't have DLSS on, it's buggy. You have to turn DLSS on, otherwise you've got these black bars at the top of the screen. So not exactly a great game in general for saying, hey, this is a stable example, when the other two competitors' cards either have the same problem or they got their own unique problem inherent to the game itself. Though furthermore, when we started testing out the FPS differential here on both the AMD and the NVIDIA cards, we found that we were dropping our FPS by about threefold. So that's about a 66% decrease in performance here, going from around 179 average FPS on the RX 9070 down to 61, of course, with those horrible 1% and 0.1% stutters. But then on the NVIDIA side, we still went from 184 average FPS on the 5070 with great 0.1% lows down to 73 average FPS. So with this game in particular, is it really worth turning on these settings for a drop in 60 to 70% of your FPS? And for me personally, it's an immediate no. Though after seeing these results, the consensus is that don't worry, AMD will patch this out. They will go back and they'll fix their drivers to then make the performance smooth with the 0.1%, 1% lows for these older games with ray tracing. And my opinion's different. I think AMD's driver team should save their resources and put them somewhere else that's worthy of being spent. Because when we look at not just the Ascent, we'll also take a look at Hellblade very soon, we can see that these are based off an RTX SDK from NVIDIA. That is a software development kit that was provided by NVIDIA, which is optimized for their RTX cores on their graphics cards, which is why when I tested these games out on the Intel B580, they also ran really bad too. So AMD's already at a huge disadvantage here, but there's actually a whole lot more to the story. So let's go dig deeper in this rabbit hole right after today's video sponsor. Do you need to get Windows 10 or Windows 11 activated and don't want to spend $200 or some other exorbitant price? Well, if so, today's video sponsor VIP SCD Keys has you covered. For as little as $15 using the coupon code BFTYC, you can get Windows 10 activated, and for a little bit more you can get Windows 11 activated too. Links in the description below to find out more. Welcome back to Tech Yes City. Now let's get on to the second game here that we tested that exhibited massive stuttering, and that was Hellblade. But what we saw here with the 9070 at 1440p on pretty much max settings with ray tracing on is that the RX 9070 would indeed have these massive stutterings on 0.1% and 1% lows, and it just caused the game to freeze for a few seconds. Whereas opposed to just turning it off, we saw our average FPS go from 62 all the way up to 166. Now in this title, the RTX 5070 did do a lot better here, scoring 190 without ray tracing on and a 0.1% low of 72 versus the 87 and 29 with ray tracing on. However, I also cross-referenced this game as well against the B580, just like the Ascent, very quickly, and that also had horrible stuttering when ray tracing was enabled. So basically, in other words, this ray tracing implementation on Unreal Engine 5 is not just affecting AMD cards, it is affecting Intel cards as well. It's just that it's affecting AMD cards a lot worse than it is infecting the Intel cards. However, that said, if AMD doesn't really know how to optimize their drivers for especially what I would feel would be proprietary parts of some of these SDKs implemented with ray tracing, it's going to make it very difficult for them to patch drivers for it naturally. And this is where we go on to the next part of the story, where it starts to go a bit deeper, at least for me personally, because there is a sequel to Hellblade called Hellblade 2. And in this particular title, the Unreal Engine 4 that they were using in the first game has been upgraded to the Unreal Engine 5. And here is where we can show you now a 4K image. So previously we were getting 1440p. Here's where we got now 4K with everything maxed, and we're getting a much smoother experience, as well as what I would say is a much better picture of this newer title, which features also ray tracing. You're probably like, well, how does it feature ray tracing? And this is where it gets interesting, because as you go into Unreal Engine 5, they've actually got their own version of ray tracing called Lumen. And they've also got the support for hardware accelerated ray tracing within the Unreal Engine 5. Now, in this particular title, Hellblade 2, I don't believe it supports hardware ray tracing, but it's using a software implementation that works on pretty much all graphics cards equally. So the playing field here is much more fair to all the graphics card manufacturers, as opposed to Hellblade on Unreal Engine 4 plus ray tracing. It's very biased towards NVIDIA graphics cards. But here's where, in this particular example, we can see that the ray tracing effects just look so much better, and the FPS is better, and you've got a smoother experience. But then the FPS advantage then goes back to the RX 9070 over that of the 5070. So then you may be wondering, what is this Lumen technology from Unreal Engine 5? Well, I feel like it's the answer for Epic Games wanting to basically give their games and their engine a much better visual fidelity experience, because of how many console users there are on games like Fortnite, for instance, versus other game manufacturers that may be relying on some of these software development kits. And what you're going to see, I feel, in the future is a lot more games coming out on Unreal Engine 5, but ultimately as well the successor Unreal Engine 6, where that'll be implemented with actually much more of a heavy emphasis on multi-threading, which will help eliminate a lot of these stuttering issues that have been caused on, I guess, roughly optimized Unreal Engine 5 games. So in other words, Epic Games, the owner of Unreal Engine 5, is doing their best to make it easier for games to be better optimized on PC, whether it's just raw performance or if it's as well ray tracing based technologies. Then back to Lumen, and you may be wondering, how exactly does this differ from ray tracing? Well, think of it if you had a torch in a scene out of the camera shot, and this torch is shining with ray tracing over the objects. What ray tracing is doing is calculating everywhere that beam hits, and then it'll either cast a shadow based on that detail, or of course it could do other things like create more intense light in a particular spot. So it's very accurate. However, ray tracing itself does cost a lot of performance from your graphical hardware and your PC. But when we go to Lumen, it uses a different way of doing things known as approximation. So it gets the whole map that's going to be rendered out, and then it basically makes calculations on where the light should be hitting, as opposed to, say, using a light source like a torch. It's basically, think of it like a magical painter that's then painting out where the light's going to go. And even though it does have a light source, it's just using much more approximation to lower the calculations involved and ultimately make things run a lot faster. Now, this works in conjunction on Unreal Engine 5 with what's known as their geometry system known as Nanite. So Lumen together with Nanite make it so that Unreal Engine 5's ray tracing technology is actually really good for getting just a better visual experience without having such huge tanking frame rates that we're seeing with a lot of implementations of ray tracing. Now, the perfect example of this is actually one from Black Myth Wukong, which is based on Unreal Engine 5, but also in this particular game, you've got the option of turning on Lumen. It just doesn't really say it in the options menu, but if you put up some settings to cinematic, you can actually then get the Lumen engine going in this particular title. And then when we compare this against NVIDIA's ray tracing, which actually in the menu system, it'll just say NVIDIA ray tracing because that's their model that's been implemented into this particular title, Wukong, you can then see the differences here, not just in the FPS levels, but you can also see the detail levels here where, for me personally, looking at both these scenes, it's not a huge difference in this particular title, but then if we look at the FPS levels, it makes it so that I would just much rather have the Lumen experience because it's actually playable and the 0.1% lows are also a lot better. In other words, the game is not stuttering when we're using the Unreal Engine 5's implementation of ray tracing versus NVIDIA's ray tracing solution. And you can see the difference is just huge in FPS. And in fact, you may even prefer outright the visual experience of Lumen in conjunction with TSR versus, say, NVIDIA's ray tracing in conjunction with DLSS. Though now we're going to move on to the poster child for Unreal Engine 5 and of course their Lumen and Nanite technology, and that would be Fortnite, where in the past, if you guys remember quite a few years back, there was actually Fortnite based on Unreal Engine 4, and this had NVIDIA RTX enabled in it. Now when you turned on NVIDIA RTX, it actually, even on NVIDIA's own RTX cards, it just blasted the performance, and it was, in my opinion, even though it looked pretty good, it was just unplayable, especially in competitive matches where the stuttering would just hit you out of nowhere and that could cost you the game. But then we fast forward to Unreal Engine 5, and in the last year especially of playing this game, I've noticed that the stuttering is non-existent now, and this game is actually running extremely smooth. But then again, they've also got that ray tracing added in, which doesn't cost your performance anywhere near as much as ray tracing from NVIDIA's side would actually cost. And here's where, for these particular examples, I'll just show you with side by side while I'm running in my benchmark map that I use, because it's pretty consistent. You can see, even though there'll be a bit of variance because I can't really track everywhere I'm running, you will see in these particular examples here, the FPS difference of turning on Lumen in this game in conjunction with Nanite versus leaving it off really only drops performance, from my calculations, maybe anywhere from the vicinity of 10 to 20%, depending on whether you're using the 9070 or using the 5070 in this particular title. Now, what we're seeing here, though, is also a massive difference, at least in my opinion, in parts of the map, at least in some parts of the map, in visual fidelity. If you're into a more immersive experience and you really want your light in the game, whether it's dark spots in the map or brighter points in the map, to feel more immersive, then this example of Lumen is going to do that with a much better performance cost than that of ray tracing itself. So after looking at this more in depth, I'm realizing, well, this is probably going to be the way of the future for gaming if we start seeing a lot of these examples of just these massive drops in performance when it comes to traditional raster versus ray tracing. And then when we see what Lumen can do, it's in its approximation methods, and we're seeing the performance drops there. So then basically what I'm noticing here is that I'm not too concerned about missing out on ray tracing a whole lot when the differences here with the Lumen technology, in my opinion, makes a huge difference to visual fidelity. But on top of that, I've also still got a very playable experience. So now, after breaking down Unreal Engine 5 and what Lumen can do, you can see it's a really powerful form of ray tracing, but that still leaves the question of, why would Epic Games be doing this when AMD, especially in the PC market, is not that big of a player? Why would they be making this whole system of their own to help gamers get ray tracing? And that's where it comes down to, simply, they're a game manufacturer as well as an engine manufacturer for games. And this is where it boils down to, simply, they're also in competition. Not really with NVIDIA, but with other game developers. And so if they've got the best system for getting visual fidelity for the FPS numbers, then a lot of people are going to want to develop their games on Unreal Engine 5. And it also comes back to AMD now. In hindsight, they should be really glad they did this, and that was win the console bids. In other words, their technology went into the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series X, and so that meant that there was no NVIDIA ray tracing cores in these consoles. And so that means that there's a huge player base out there for Epic Games to then do what they do with their engine on Unreal Engine 5 and make it so that it's getting the best visual fidelity. And adding Lumen into that, as well as Nanite, makes it so that the game developers are now, in not probably being an intention of Epic Games, they're now in direct competition with NVIDIA and their ray tracing model. And what I'm seeing here, ultimately in terms of practicality, is a system that's just working much better and giving you a much more playable experience. So now we've looked at Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5, this then went back to the question for me personally of, should AMD's driver team go back and optimize their drivers and fix all these problems for what some would say arguably is a proprietary software development kit for these Unreal Engine 4 games? And in my opinion, they shouldn't just bother with it. Just turn ray tracing off with these games and look forward to the future where we're getting proper competition and better optimization for AMD hardware. And I feel like AMD's driver team should then optimize their drivers for these games and getting something that's on a fair playing field, or a much fairer playing field, and getting the performance right. Though before we get on out of here, I will say, on the note of what AMD should be optimizing for, I did get a request from another YouTuber called Frame Chasers, and he told me to check out Overwatch. And he said that the AMD 0.1% lows were unbearable here. So I decided to have a look at this game and just at least test it in an apples to apples scenario. And here's where the 0.1% lows were actually extremely impressive at both 1080p low settings and 4K low settings. Then we move over to the RTX 5070. We actually scored higher 0.1% lows on the AMD significantly. So perhaps since when he used his RX 9070 or RX 9070 XT, there has been some game updates, driver updates that have made it so that the AMD card is now getting a really smooth experience on Overwatch 2. But it makes it so that this is what AMD is doing, and this is what I said in the previous video we made. AMD's doing the things right that they need to do right, and that's optimized for games that a lot of people are playing. And here's where the next example that he did tell me to test was Sons of the Forest. And here's where I did test with FSR 3, and this was at 1440p because it gave us a nice over 100 FPS average experience. And then I tested that against the RTX 5070. And here's where the RTX 5070 did have the advantage, especially on the 0.1% lows. And so there is a valid argument there. And this is on a different engine, I believe, called the Unity engine. And so for this particular game, instead of AMD wasting their driver team resources optimizing for an Unreal Engine 4 game that globally 40 people, I think, were playing it, and out of those, how many are using an AMD card, right? So you could be even down to like 4 or 5 people. They should be optimizing for a game like Sons of the Forest, where there's over 10,000 people at any given time. So getting this game then optimized on the 0.1% lows, as well as getting things like FSR 4 in, where there's no real TSR inbuilt option for this game, because for instance, Epic Games Unreal Engine 5, that also has the benefit of having a really good inbuilt upscaler, temporal upscaler called TSR in their games. Unlike that, this game could really utilize FSR 4. And so for me personally, what AMD's driver team should and shouldn't do, I guess differs from the consensus, but that said, that's based on my own research that I'm just sharing with you guys here today, because I really enjoyed going down this rabbit hole and seeing that the Unreal Engine 4 plus ray tracing, for me personally, missing out on this, in my testing, I wasn't missing out on a whole lot. Really, I was missing out on a lot of FPS and stuttering when I turned it on. And even if it was a much smoother 1 and 0.1% low experience, I'd still be turning that off in this game because of just the sheer amount of FPS that you're losing when you turn on these technologies in these games, as opposed to the Unreal Engine 5 examples. Those games just look infinitely better, and they're also playing a lot smoother. Anyhow guys, with all that out of the way, hope you enjoyed today's video and ultimately story time. And do let us know in the comments section below, what do you think AMD should be optimizing their drivers for? Do you think we should be calling out these kinds of things? I mean, for me personally, I'm just calling out how bad of an implementation this is for software when these games were released years and years ago. For instance, Senua's Sacrifice, I think it was 2017 it was released, and then like four years later, nearly 4 years later, it gets this update with ray tracing. It just seems so weird that these things come out, and then it just so happens to be that the competitor's graphics card, AMD, is running like complete crap on this game with these features that come out. So, but all that aside, the last thing is ultimately it just comes down to, regardless of all that, the visual experience on what I'm actually getting when I turn this setting on. And for me personally, I'm just not getting anything out of this particular game when I turn it on. In fact, it shouldn't even be in the game. AMD, all you need to do with the driver update for Sanoa's Sacrifice is just go in, detect an AMD graphics card, and then just take out the option to turn on ray tracing altogether. I think that's the solution. Bingo. Solved it there for you guys. Thank me later. And so with this whole situation, it makes you wonder, how did we even get here to begin with? I don't know. I'll let you guys decide in the comments. And with that aside, I'm going to get on out of here, and I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.